rumble on the river. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement inspired by the late Art McConville from the Umatilla tribe. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, and Clackamas bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We acknowledge that Portland, Oregon has the 9th largest urban Native American population in the United States, with over 380 tribes represented in the region. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands and waters since time immemorial. They have many songs about the river and a sincere, close connection to it. Tribal people have protected and cared for the safety of the river without chemicals and disruptions. They hope to restore it to its original way, pure and able to support activities for generations to come. May we approach our work in the same way and acknowledge our responsibility to do so as guests upon these lands and these waters. I'm Jan Zuckerman, and I'm super honored to be the moderator, a little nervous, for tonight's forum. I taught for over 30 years for Portland Public Schools and had the great privilege to co-found the Environmental Middle School, which is now Sunnyside Environmental School, with Sarah Taylor, who's around here somewhere, who you may know, and others, at a time when educators were actually trusted to do their job. I'm now retired, but continue to be an educator activist because I cannot bear to sit by while we continue to put our communities, especially our children, in harm's way. Here's a few logistics for this evening. First of all, I'd like to thank Columbia Riverkeeper for this beautiful venue. They paid for this venue, so thank them. If you can, please contribute to the cost of future rumbles, which are minimal, but we want to keep them free. There's a little container by the cookies back there. Just put some, whatever you have in there. Anything is great. Also, many thanks to Hana Rosa Francis, who is our videographer for this evening. She's right there. Thank you. Please feel free to get up and move around. Take care of yourself. The bathrooms are located through that door to the right. Pretty easy to find. There's plenty of cookies and there's water. And before you leave, make sure to visit the organizational tables that are around the room and read the posted quotes that are all up, also posted on the wall. The back of your program has updated contact information for your elected officials. It's super important to communicate with them regularly about your concerns and ideas. They really do take those into account. A big thank you to our 35 co-sponsors and their help with getting the word about out and about in their newsletters and their alerts. So you can see them right here up at this screen right here. Those are all the names of them. We actually had, just hopefully you're not too grumbly and the getting grumbled. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so before I introduce our distinguished panel tonight, I'm going to provide a brief background as to why we are here. The Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub, known as the CEI Hub, is located on 6 miles of land sandwiched between the Willamette River and Forest Park in northwest Portland. This area, designated by the city as Giles Lake Industrial Sanctuary, is zoned for heavy industrial and was once a system of lakes and wetlands. It now stores over 90% of Oregon's liquid fuels in hundreds of tanks, many decades old, on unstable land in a floodplain, which will liquefy during an earthquake. The creation of this quote-unquote sanctuary not only displaced community, but continues to do so, virtually cutting off all access to the river. The day-to-day pollution, seismic risk, and climate impact of heavy industry next to a highly populated urban area on our river is unsafe. Not only is this area part of a federal Superfund site, it houses Zenith Energy, an oil export facility. Despite our city's promise to find a legal way to shut them down, they gave them the green light to continue bringing in oil for 5 more years with promises to transition to renewable diesel. This is part of a broader plan to make this already toxic, vulnerable area a biofuel hub. We are witnessing the horrific effects of the compound environmental degradation and climate catastrophe in Maui, fires engulfing Canada and other places around the globe, severe weather events in California. We in the Pacific Northwest are facing drought, fires, record-breaking temperatures with heat-related deaths. Yet we allow more and more trains to bring flammable cargo through our communities with no sane plan for evacuation. Sanctuary or sacrifice zone? Do we sit by as officials take little or no action to address the elephant in our own backyard? According to Mark Rupp, Adaptation Program Director of the Georgetown Climate Center in Washington, the challenge that Hawaii and all states are facing is the ways in which climate change is upending the assumptions that underlie the best thought out plan. What can we learn from these disasters to prevent irreversible damage here at home? Our panel this evening will provide some insight into how we got here and what we can do about it. With that, I'd like to introduce them. We'd like to welcome Bob Salinger. He's the Urban Conservation Director with Willamette Riverkeeper. Vivek Shandas, PSU Professor of Geography, founder and director of Sustaining Urban Places Research. Jana Papaethimiou. Did I say that?
Yes, you totally
Woo!
did.
All right. Oregon State Resilience Officer. And Nick Caleb, staff attorney with Breach Collective. I'm sorry that Kate Murphy cannot make it tonight, but I think we've got a dynamo panel right here. After they speak, there will be a little bit of time for question and answer, Q&A. We're doing this a little bit differently this time. I am going to ask the panelists one question and then give them time to ask questions of each other. And if time allows, we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. We're going to begin with Bob Salinger. Bob?
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. I've been working on river issues for about 30 years, 31 years now, 30 of them for a bird organization that shall remain nameless because it doesn't have a name at the moment, and one for about a half a year for Willamette Riverkeeper. And we have this amazing landscape that we have not taken very good care of. When we build our cities, we tend to build them in ways that ignore nature. And we tend to put them in biodiversity hotspots, where the confluence of these two amazing rivers, it's a salmon highway, it's a bird highway. It was once this incredible, vast floodplain, but we've filled it, we've hardened our landscape. We've contained our river, we've steepened its banks, we've denuded its banks, we've polluted it, we've flushed our garbage into it. We haven't taken very good care of our landscape. We've made a lot of progress over the last 40 years, though. We've been moving in the right direction, and Portland has been a leader in green infrastructure, in protecting and restoring that urban landscape, and it's known nationally and internationally for it. But we have also stalled. And who here in this room thinks that we've done enough? You know, the lessons of the last couple of years have been that climate change is accelerating, and we need to as well. The places that we thought were safe are completely unsafe. And you only need to look as far as California. You know, we worry about floodplains, and I'm going to talk about floodplains tonight. Southern California is getting flooded in places that no one ever thought was going to flood. Who thought that Maui was going to burn? We're learning the hard way that we are not doing anywhere near enough. We need to accelerate, not start going backwards. So tonight, unfortunately, I'm going to talk about how we're going backwards. And I would say that we are facing the biggest rollback of urban environmental protections that we have ever seen since the protections were put in place. We're in an unprecedented time. And unfortunately, the housing crisis is being used as a pretext for rolling back environmental regulations. The Home Builders Association and other big developers have figured out that this is a great lever to use at the local and the state level to roll back the progress we've made. And I think the core message I want to deliver tonight is that we have a housing crisis and a climate crisis, and we need to address both, and they need to work together if we want healthy, safe, equitable landscapes. And that's a message that we need to send loud and clear to our city council, and unfortunately we also need to send it to our governor. So I'm not going to talk about the hub. Other three folks I'm sure are going to hit it pretty hard. I'm going to talk about two big threats. The first is, who heard about House Bill 3414 last session?
Is that the one that built in Whitewater?
Yes, but more than that. House Bill 3414 was the governor's priority bill. She came to the legislature 3 times to testify in support of House Bill 3414. It was her bill. What House Bill 3414 did was give variances, exceptions to housing developers, any housing developer, whether they're building affordable housing or a subdivision of McMansions, from land use regulations. What kinds of land use regulations was it going to exempt them from? Tree codes, the Willamette River Greenway, wetland protections, environmental zones. The list goes on and on and on. The stuff that you see that is green on our landscape would have been vulnerable. Housing developers could apply for as many variances as they wanted, and they did not have to show any public benefit whatsoever. It was a complete, pure, total giveaway to developers. When I talked to the governor's staff, and I know some of the governor's staff is here tonight, and I've worked with Jana for, 20 years, Jana is an amazing resource. I hope she can fix the governor's office. But so no offense, but what I'm going to say. This bill was absolutely outrageous. When we asked the governor's staff about wiping out the tree code, because basically every developer could just clear their lot with impunity, their answer to me was, what, Bob, don't you understand about the fact that trees cost developers money? When I said, you're even going to let people building McMansions cut down trees and fill wetlands and encroach in the greenway? Yeah, because we believe that if we build more mansions, that adds to the housing stock, and people who can move into those, and that will free up less expensive housing. It's the trickle-down theory of housing. How well did that work for Ronald Reagan? Yeah, how well did it work for America? That bill almost passed. She also went after the urban growth boundary. Willamette Riverkeeper declared it the governor's Urban Deforestation Act. We were going to make signs with the governor with a chainsaw and a tree stump that says, "This tree stump brought to you courtesy of the governor of Oregon." They would not back down on this until they were forced to. It missed passing by 1 vote on the last day of the legislature, in the last hour of the legislature. And actually, the score was 15-10 in favor, but they needed 16 votes to have a majority of the legislature. The only reason it didn't pass was because 6 Republicans who would have voted for it did not show up. The governor teamed up with anti-environment Republicans to roll Democrats and to roll communities. And frankly, if a Republican had been elected and brought this forward, they would have been crucified. But because it was a Democrat, a lot of people were not comfortable standing up and saying what was going on. She's bringing it back. In the last couple of weeks, her Housing Advisory Council, which is dominated by big developers, has urged her to eliminate urban tree codes and to eliminate protections for isolated wetlands. For comparison's sake, it's worth noting that when President Trump proposed exactly the same thing with wetlands, Governor Brown went to the legislature and passed legislation saying there would be no rollback in Oregon. That if Trump rolled back environmental regulations, Oregon would keep it in place and backfill to make sure that we didn't go backwards. This governor has surrounded herself with advisors, except for Jana, who are actually advocating for the Trump agenda. The wetlands proposal is exactly the same as what Trump proposed. And who here thinks it's a good idea to put poor marginalized communities in wetlands?
Been there, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we're basically turning equity upside down, inside out, and backwards at the behest of big housing developers. The governor has promised that she will bring it back in the next session. I take her seriously, And so we're starting sending a message now. We've had our hand extended. We believe there is a housing crisis. I don't think anybody in this room doubts it. And we believe that there probably are places that we could make changes to improve things. That's reasonable. It's not reasonable to basically go and clear cut and bulldoze all of our environmental regulations at the behest of big time developers. And so at the same time that we are extending our hand and more or less having it slapped, we're also trying to put a lot of pressure on the legislature to make sure that they know it's going to be a total storm of protest if they go forward with this. And to know that the Democrats cannot take the community for granted. And if that means that some of them lose to Republicans in the next next election, that's actually okay. I don't want to see that happen, frankly, but if they're going to pull this kind of stuff, we're in unprecedented territory. We're not talking about bad Democratic proposals. We're talking about bad Republican proposals at this point. I think the message needs to be very loud. It needs to be very clear. We'll post Willamette Riverkeeper's website. If you go to that, there's an action alert right now out there to try and generate opposition to the proposals that are emerging as we speak. Please do write. It is making a difference. The second thing I want to talk about tonight is what's going on at the City of Portland. We have some of the worst environmental leadership we've ever seen in the City of Portland. In fact, it's not the worst environmental leadership. There simply is no environmental leadership right now. There's nobody that's championing the environment, and we're seeing a trickle-down effect of the governor's assault on the environment. So a couple of things to be aware of. City's floodplain resilience plan is going to City Council next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. This is a plan that they were forced to develop based on a lawsuit that I brought when I was at Audubon in 2009 that basically got a biological opinion from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and I won't go into the details here, that said that floodplain development in Oregon is jeopardizing the continued existence of salmon. That we are destroying salmon habitat at such a rate in floodplains that it is jeopardizing the continued existence of these species. It's also jeopardizing the continued existence of resident killer whales that depend on salmon for food. A jeopardy decision under the Endangered Species Act is incredibly rare. You almost never get them. You get may affect, likely to affect, won't affect. You don't get jeopardized as the continued existence. Unfortunately, we're subsidizing floodplain development. The National Flood Insurance Program provides taxpayer-subsidized insurance so people can develop in floodplains and then get paid out when they flood. And so this lawsuit resulted in a biological opinion that said, FEMA, who manages the National Flood Insurance Program, you need to update your regulations to make sure that, one, we don't develop in really high hazard areas. And who here thinks it's a good idea to put development in high hazard flood areas? Well, our politicians do. And so they basically have to update their flood regulations. They have not done that. Willamette Riverkeeper, Center for Biological Diversity, and others are bringing a lawsuit to try and force them to do that now. But the City of Portland also has to step up, and we thought they were doing that. Unfortunately, the floodplain resilience plan that is going forward to council has been gutted in the last several months at the behest of big developers. So a couple of things to be aware of. One, it doesn't cover most of the city. Doesn't cover industrial lands, doesn't cover the North Reach, doesn't cover the Columbia Corridor, doesn't cover Johnson Creek. That's being kicked down the road to the future. They've already had 8 years, but they're not even getting to those places. They have exempted industrial lands because, because industrial developers are powerful. They've exempted South Waterfront because there's big, powerful developers at South Waterfront. They have not updated their flood maps because why should we have updated flood maps? Who wants to know where we're going to flood? They have decided that if they do adopt the plan, it's not going to go into effect for 2 years in order to allow people to come in for permits and vest before the plan goes forward. And they've also extended the time that they have to develop after they vest to 7 years. Basically, it's a giant effort to make sure that no one ever has to comply with new flood regulations. And this doesn't mean that people can't develop in floodplains. What it says is we have to avoid the highest hazard areas, and if you do develop in floodplains, you have to mitigate for those impacts. You have to restore habitat. You have to balance your cut and fill. If you're going to fill a floodplain, you got to cut somewhere nearby so that we still have flood storage, and so on and so forth. It transfers the cost of development from floodplains from the taxpayer, again, our flood insurance program is $22 billion in debt because of places like New Orleans and other cities that have flooded. It transfers it back to the developers as if you're going to do this, you need to internalize the cost. You need to protect the environment. You need to meet the Endangered Species Act. We believe that if the city goes forward with the plan that they have, that they will be subject to litigation. We believe that it will clearly violate the Endangered Species Act. We happen to have the weakest link in the Willamette River in downtown Portland. Every salmon that uses the Willamette River has to pass through downtown Portland. And so if we don't protect habitat there that's already severely degraded, it just makes it worse. So we think there's a very strong case, if they go forward, that they will be vulnerable to litigation. We think that will happen. I hope that doesn't happen. What I hope happens is they fix the problem because it's good for our economy, it's good for human health and safety, it's good for the environment. Again, we'll put up a website for Willamette Riverkeeper. If you go there, you can see our action alert. We need really strong voices on Wednesday to testify before City Council to send a strong message, not just about floodplains, but about the fact that we need council to step up and develop a real environmental agenda. I can't tell you how sick I am of these resolutions that we pass, the climate emergency resolution, where we spend 6 months laboring over the whereas clauses so the city can do absolutely nothing. And I'll end by just saying that we have very little to no environmental leadership at the state level right now or at the local level. And I think we need to send a strong message at the next election. Most of our elected officials have gotten into office in recent years with no environmental platform whatsoever. Zero. We need to demand they have an environmental platform. We need to demand that that is specific. It lists what they are going to do, what they're going to accomplish so we can hold them accountable. And we need to run candidates, especially in the city of Portland, where we're going to have a whole lot of them, who actually do have a true environmental agenda, because we can't keep going backwards at this point. So thanks.
Urban Places Research, and nationally known for sure. So here you go, Vivek.
Thanks, Jan. Hard following Bob, but I could say the same about these two as well, Nick and Jana. But lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. I'll stand. I can think better when I'm standing. Think about this scenario for a second. May 2020. Sure. I'll hold it closer. Thank you. Think about this scenario for a second. May 2026. Temperatures reach 110 degrees. There's a wildfire burning in the Cascades with winds blowing from the west, or blowing from the east, blowing the smoke west. There's a intense run on our energy grid because it's so hot. PGE Pacific Power shed as much energy and load as they can, meaning there's a blackout, and we are stuck in a situation where that simple scenario, which has a high level of probability, puts thousands of people in hospital beds. The older adults, those who have less ability to cope with that heat and that constant exposure to wildfire smoke, are the first wave of people in the hospital. Then there's subsequent waves of children, of those who are marginalized. Eventually, those who are unhoused and others find their way to the hospital. That would make the pandemic seem like a walk in the park. Those are the kinds of scenarios I'm finding myself talking about more and more, because the kinds of scenarios that are coming up are unprecedented. And we're using that word over and over with Maui, or with what we're seeing in Greece, or what we're seeing anywhere you point at a map on the globe, we see these scenarios. So that's where we are in trying to reconcile with what the Earth is trying to do. She is simply trying to move the temperature so that it's even across the planet. That's all she's trying to do. And heat, as it turns out, is the primary agent around which climate change and all these intense fires, storms, rainfalls, hurricanes, etc. are occurring. Heat is what is driving the entire cycle, right? And so I came to Oregon in 1995 excited about the fact that there was a outdoor school program for 6th graders who got to go tromp around in the creeks, climb around in the forests, and I was out in Vernonia at Larry Steele's basketball camp with 6th graders from Washington County having the time of my life. I worked the hardest I'd ever worked, met the most magical people I had ever met, these 12 and 13-year-olds, who were so precocious, so curious, and so transformed after 5 days of spending time out in the woods. That planted a seed so deep in my heart that when I had a chance to come back to Oregon again in 2005 after graduate school in New York and Washington State, coming back here was a dream. And at that same time, I was blown away by this manifesto that somebody from Arizona State University had read to me saying, we, the faculty, staff, and students at Portland State University, will commit to sustainability, the environmental movement, and it went on for 10 pages to basically claim this city and this university as a place for the future of the sustainability movement. And the environmental regulations and all the kinds of things that Bob was bringing up is what compelled me to come to Portland and wanting to really set up shop here. When I arrived, I was coming here with interest in water. Portland had been doing amazing things with bioswales at the time. Of course, that had to do with a 1995 lawsuit that was filed against the Bureau of Environmental Services for total maximum daily load overflows into the Willamette River, which then compelled the hiring of a director that oversaw the big pipe, right? So this was all the 90s were coming in, and the argument was that we could save money by putting in a big pipe and by setting up these green bioswales in neighborhoods for capturing that stormwater, saving $84 million in a small area, actually right where we're sitting right now, or standing right now, called Tabor to the River. Big project, played out for 20 years, called it good in 2015. Directors stepped down because that was done. That project was done. And during that time, I started scratching my head and started wondering, like, what is missing with this issue? Because we've got water that's right at the heart of this, but are we and at the same time in 2009, 2010, these heat waves started moving through the region in intensity. And I was scratching my head, who's looking at this? Is there anyone in the city looking at this? Is there an opportunity for us to kind of understand this issue of the relationship between winter storms that are coming through and flooding streets and summertime heat waves? And at that time, there was not a single person really looking at this from a municipal scale. And so I got started on this in about 2008, 2009, of trying to understand what the distribution of temperatures are in this city. And we went around with grad students measuring these temperatures, collecting data. And I remember sitting in the Portland building downtown, and we had city folk, we had Oregon Health Authority, we had folks from the state, DEQ, and we were describing what we were finding. We're finding these temperature differences of 20 degrees Fahrenheit from one neighborhood to another. And we were saying, this is showing a pretty clear disparity of who's going to be exposed and who's not going to be exposed when a 110-degree heat wave comes through. There was pause, and then there was a lot of laughter. Because everybody was saying this is a temperate climate. We're not going to break 105, let alone 110. Never. It's never going to happen. Right? Fast forward through that time, 10 years later, we get a massive heat dome that settles hot air over the Pacific Northwest and lingers. And this is the amazing thing about the Earth, is that the particular ways in which we've changed the climate, there are moments when the air completely will bubble up and stagnate. right? It's a meteorological phenomenon that's been around for a long time, though with a rapidly transforming climate, these heat domes, which right now is settled. I just talked to some folks in Wichita in Kansas. There's a massive heat dome over the Midwest and over Kansas right now, where temperatures, I was just talking to Dave Hondula in Phoenix, who's the chief heat officer this morning, and he was telling me they're still working on 115 going on after a month of that. They're still not out of the heat yet. And yet people continue to show up at the hospitals, and fortunately they haven't had a massive blackout, and energy systems are still up and running. So I started asking the question, what's going to happen if that happens in a 45 latitude like where we are? And everyone's just kind of like casual and really not really giving it much attention. And I feel like we're in a very similar almost moment right now where we're talking about the critical energy infrastructure, and the risk is right in front of us. It is a monstrous risk. It makes heat domes seem like really not much of an issue when it comes to the scale of impact that a Cascadia subduction zone, a scenario of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake with the elimination of bridges, of roads, and of potential fires in the critical infrastructure hub. And so we're in the same moment, and I'm kind of scratching my head and saying, what did I learn about all of that work with heat over the last decade? I learned that you can present a scenario, you can present compelling data, you can present compelling narratives about it, yet the prioritization of some of these particular issues is really based on the movement of communities that are going to galvanize behind it. That's really what I've come to pick up on. And I've seen this as chair of the Urban Forestry Commission. When I spent the last 8 years as chair of that commission for the city of Portland, I saw over and over a little window into the way the city bureaucracy works. And as somebody who had been pretty steeped in the research and kind of academic world, to have that opportunity to really steep into that world gave me a true appreciation for how decisions are made and for what it takes to move some decisions. I remember once, actually, Jan, you were there. I just want a side tangent here. We had a group of high school students show up at the commission meeting, and it was just amazing. They were pissed, and they were saying, we want action on trees. The city is not taking the strong enough stance on this. We're seeing trees come down. I had just presented a case study, a paper that was essentially showing that the hottest areas in Portland were seeing and still actually is happening now, are seeing the fastest decline of tree canopy in the city. We've actually now done this for 33 cities across the country, a paper that's coming out in the fall. We looked at 33 cities across the country and looked at where the trees were coming down the fastest, and they are systematically coming down in places that have the hottest air temperatures in these neighborhoods. So it's a Portland phenomenon reflecting something far, I think, more systemic across the way we're looking at development, and where that development is going. In fact, if you look at development over the last 10 years, where the most development has occurred is in historically disinvested areas of cities in the country. So areas that were in the 1930s redlined, meaning they were marked up and said, this is where the poor folk live, this is where the colored folk live, this is where the immigrant folk live, and we're going to mark a red line around it and not resource it whatsoever. Those are the areas that are A, the hottest of these cities, and now B, where the shade from trees is being lost the fastest. Not only relative to the rest of each of these cities, but also absolute amount of loss is the greatest in these particular disinvested parts of cities. So what I'd love to bring into this conversation is the simple fact that we have a systemic challenge of not only developers kind of running a lot of the decision-making that's happening on whether it be particular bills at the state or local level. We have a system within which these disproportionate impacts have been, continue to be amplified. And we're seeing this not only at the simple indicator, which I like to do, is count trees in cities. So going out and seeing where these trees are growing, where they're being planted. pales in comparison to the amount of loss that we're seeing right now with our green one-legged kin. And it's a very easy, measurable indicator for what we're talking about when we're talking about wetlands being lost, or we're talking about trees being mowed over by developments that go from lot line to lot line. And so when I came to Portland, a big push was, wow, this environmental ethic. We've got 6th graders going to camp. We've got policies that are so entrenched. And so suddenly in the last few years, I'm just taking a deep breath and asking myself, like, where have we completely lost the direction? Where have we started to kind of turn this corner where we're starting to see, not only at the worst time possible when temperatures are going up and there's more atmospheric moisture in the air, which means that when it rains, it's going to pour, and trees, green space, etc., collect a lot of this, wetlands collect a lot of this water, cool the temperatures, and yet what we're seeing is the exact opposite that's happening right now. So I'm, as somebody who's outside of the decision-making or even the lobbying effort, my role has largely been at this point to leak information to folks so that they can take it and do good with it, right? That's kind of where I have decided I want to position myself. I have no interest in running for office, no interest for being in a position of that public decision-making, but I'm happy to play a role in providing that information to folks so that they can build on it and be able to start making the decisions that will think about this place 30, 50, 100, maybe 1,000 years from now. And that's really what we're talking about in terms of how do we keep this place as lovely, as beautiful as when I first landed here. I almost want to just step, if I have 1 minute, just step into this. Okay, just step into this for just 1 second, because part of my place in this is my parents moved from 8 degrees above the equator, 10,000 miles to Northern California when I was 10 years old, and I grew up among the redwoods. And so I was immediately smitten at an early age, and if anybody who has been around those magnificent beasts, as I like to call the charismatic megaflora, it is just a completely captivating moment. And so since that moment, I've been trying to navigate landscapes, because the landscape I came from, there were huge fig trees. There were monkeys on trees right next to the apartment building I grew up in. And all of a sudden, here's these magnificent trees, here's this completely different landscape. And the interesting thing about my trying to navigate that was essentially trying to find the fact that why was this house in this particular location, and all the, back up 1 sec. When I was walking to school every morning as a child, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I would interact with probably about 12 to 14 large creatures, not humans. I would see cows, I would see buffalo, I would see chickens, I would see goats, all on the streets, right? This is my introduction into urban ecology. And it was wild to be in that environment and to suddenly arrive in a place where I didn't see a single creature, human or otherwise, when I walked around the streets of Santa Rosa, California. And this was the moment where I started realizing the way we're going about linking or even placing specific land uses and the assumptions that go into those land uses, those in relation to what we're trying to plan for have completely kind of been detached. At this point, we know Cascadia is happening. We know that climate is going to really unravel, and we are going to see a climate system that becomes very chaotic. And at the same time, we have a built infrastructure that is very precariously positioned. And so you bring those things together, and the land use decisions we've made over the past few years are not going to enable us to get through this coming set of decades. And so as I think about it, and I travel, have fortune to travel different parts of the country and world, I'm starting to see that the decisions that we've made over the last century will take a tremendous amount of political effort and social effort to reimagine. And I would encourage us to really think about an idea that I found a lot of promise in, this idea of backcasting. The scenario I started with about the heat wave, wildfire, energy grid failure, that was a scenario we played out in several different cities on a project that we worked on in North America. And what we were able to do is work with community-based organizations to backcast from 2080 to the present day in terms of what were the things that really would need to be in place in order for us to be able to reach that 2080 intact. And that backcasting scenario planning exercise was something that generated art in terms of what the landscapes would look like, what we could see in terms of this river, this beautiful painted river system over here, and trying to really imagine what the landscape would look like in that 2080 scenario. And then how do we kind of backcast from that moment today going forward. So with that, I just want to open it up to questions, hand it over to Jana, maybe back to Jan first to introduce Jana, and then go from there.
Thank you so much, Vivek. Thank you. Wow. Okay, so next we have Jana Papaefimiu, our Oregon State Resilience Officer, and I know you will have a lot to say.
I will, yeah.
We're excited to hear you.
Thank you so much. It's a total pleasure to be here tonight. As she said, my name is Jana Papaefimiu. I can't, although then I won't be able to see my notes. But I can see you better. Thank you. I am your state resilience officer, and I work for Governor Tina Kotek. I am her policy advisor on emergency management and disaster resilience. And it's such a I always feel like I have to say this when I'm at Taborspace. It's always such a pleasure to speak here. I was born like 5 blocks from here at the corner of 70th and Belmont, where the old hospital is. So I feel like such a connection to this neighborhood. And I grew up in Portland, and I live in Selwood now, just a couple blocks from the Willamette River. And until the algae bloom crept its way up to the dock in Selwood, I've been swimming in the river just about every day all summer. It's been fantastic. I am, I am speaking for myself tonight. I work for the governor, and I am delighted to be your policy advisor. I did not prepare my remarks very far ahead or run them by our comms team, so I'm not authorized to be her spokesperson. So I want to be clear about that. What I'm hoping to talk about tonight is, first, not to talk too much, because I feel like I've heard I'm like, guys, we gotta go and get a beer. I have so many things I want to ask you about after this. So I want to make space for us all to have that conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about the meaning of resilience, kind of how I think about what that's a kind of a squishy concept. Like, what does that mean? Why I think it's so important right now. To center the concept of resilience in our policymaking work, and then kind of what I think might be the right role for government in terms of building resilience. And I'm going to talk about that for a minute, and then I hope that we can go to conversation after that, because the governor is still building her resilience agenda, and I have an opportunity to influence that, and I think it needs to be a collective effort, and I want to be influenced by this community also. And I'll mention at this time too, I think my posters are still up in the back. Yeah, so I have some questions in the back about resilience and kind of what you feel hopeful about, or what makes you feel resilient right now. That I'm also, if you haven't already shared something, I invite you to do that before you go, because I'm going to take those home and study them. But so what is resilience? In the broadest term, resilience is the ability to withstand, recover, and thrive after a disruptive event, right? So it doesn't always mean to come back to the place that you were before, but it means to go through hardship and to come to a good place and a stable place at the end of that. So that can play out at a lot of scales. At a personal level, individuals can be resilient, and we can imagine things that make people resilient, like stable housing, food security, a community of people that they care about them, and support them. And we have a community of resilient people. We can have resilient neighborhoods and resilient cities, a resilient state. And as we scale up, I think we also start to see sort of resilient systems. So not just resilient you're resilient because you have food security, but we have a resilient food system, so everyone can have food security, right? That builds broader resilience. Not just like you have a really reliable car, but we have a reliable transportation system, so everyone can have resilience. So that's how I think of it, is like building those systems that support everyone to come through difficult times and have a good life at the end. I think that it's so important now because looking forward, we see so many tremendous challenges to our individual and collective resilience. I was the emergency manager for the city of Portland for 10 years before I came to this job, and I saw, even in the just 10 years that I was there, the accelerating impacts of climate change on our own community. Bob and Vivek have talked about that, but I mean, I was there on the hottest night of the heat dome in the Oregon Convention Center working the night shift at the shelter, and just for me, that was the moment where I looked out at this total cross-section of Portland. A lot of houseless folks that came in to get cool, but also older people that were, couldn't cool their apartments and they weren't safe there. Moms with really small children in the same place. Like, they had infants that they didn't feel safe at home when it was 110 degrees inside. And people that were, it was just the collection of everyone who had no place else to go, and everyone was safe there, and it was cool, and we had food to eat. But man, it was like other than that, it was the last place that you wanted to be, you know? That there was, it was crowded. There was folks that were really struggling with so many other issues before they ever got there, and you really saw the inequity of the impacts of climate change and how that was just really bearing down hard on our community. And that experience for me was very impactful. But even in the few months that I've been in the governor's office, I already see how that I was maybe very parochial being in Portland, and now looking out across the entire state and the tremendous impact that wildfires have had and are having right now. It's burning in Lake County, it's burning in Curry County, it's burning on the Warm Springs Reservation. Man, we could smell the smoke in Portland, but I drove down to Eugene on Monday and literally could see the flames from I-5. And fire is a natural part of the landscape. I know Bob's going to remind me of that. We've seen, but the huge fires that we are seeing now, the way that they're spreading across the state, and also the cascading impacts of those disasters. Even in the last 2 weeks, you were just talking about the energy grid. Last week on Monday, Oregon consumed more power in one day than it ever has in the history of the state. Yeah, it consumes so much power that although we're normally a net exporter of power and we sell power to California because we have abundant power from hydro, we were buying power from California from their dirty fuel and sort of running the transmission lines backwards to try and have enough power here in Oregon, because so many people have bought air conditioning since the heat dome. So our energy consumption is going up, and we started to think about, what if we had an outage now in the middle of that's not a what if scenario. That's something we were planning for last week, right? And even this week, what we see is we're still having fires in Curry County. They're trying to control the flat fire there. In the adjacent county, they were flooding because of Hurricane Hillary, and the Snake River Correctional Facility was flooding, and they were trying to borrow sandbags from Curry County that was on fire. And we said, what is this craziness that we're flooding at the same time that the next door county's on fire? They were like, could we trade you some water for some sandbags, man? But I think those are just the impacts that we are going to continue to see, is this cascading impacts of disasters. And so in that space, like, how can we build, I think we must continue to divest from fossil fuels and imagine the decarbonized future, and also climate change is happening like right now today. So we need to build those strategies, and that's why I feel like resilience is so important right now. And this resilience is also such a stretchy concept, right? And so the question I've been asking myself is, like, what's the right rule for government in building resilience? Is it, because I feel like this event right here is building resilience, right? Of people connecting. The vegetarian potluck is like the foundation of so much of my personal resilience, right? Or like being in community. Like, there's a lot. So there's things people can do. People build resilience in their own lives, right? But what should government be doing to build resilience? I asked myself that, and I feel like what I'm coming to is that we have an obligation to do the things that only government can do, right? So that means infrastructure, the stuff that government provides, like water systems and transportation. We have an obligation to provide those in a resilient way, in a climate smart way, that's going to, so that people can rely on those systems when they need them the most. And that's going to be a focus of my work and of the governor's work, right? Like, this has to last. Two, it's not just that built environment, although that's a part of the infrastructure, it's also natural environments, right? Because that's like the foundation of wetlands, and that's also a part of our infrastructure, and that has to be resilient to climate change, so we have to continue to make that possible. And that can also mean regulatory strategies, because the government can make rules in a way nobody else can. So we do have that obligation to build those strategies into resilience. Equally, I think we have an obligation to repair past harms, right? So when I think about my experience in the heat shelter, and I look around at who's there, who is there? Disproportionately, it's people of color, right? It's people with disabilities, it's elders. It's people who the system has failed them massively in other ways, and that's how come they're there. And for many of them, it's the historical, it has deep roots, and it's not to say it's just in history, because it's also happening right now. That's why they're there in the shelter. And so I feel like we have an obligation to center our resilience work in service to those communities that are disproportionately impacted and that have historically been underserved and continue to be marginalized and underserved. Something I want to come back to that I've been struggling with is how do we do that? How do we balance those, right? Because houselessness is a problem, and I know Bob is also a humanitarian. He would admit that. Maybe and when we look at who's struggling with the houseless crisis right now, it is disproportionately underserved communities. So how do we meet their needs without how do we acknowledge the justness of those folks also needing housing, and not for us, I'm gonna guess majority of people here, yeah, I got mine, cut down some trees and built my house, so now I have a house and I'm safe. So now I also, though, have an obligation to make room in the community for others, right? That are not that are unhoused. We can't say like, oh, it's okay to cut down the trees where my house was, but now no, with the proposed rules, with the rule that says a 3 million gallon tank can only spill 42 gallons of fuel, right? Because that's the minimum reportable quantity. So they'll have to keep their giant tank to a very small amount of spilling after they do the mitigation. But a 300 gallon tank could spill the whole thing, and that's not regulated because the rulemaking right now only applies to very large tanks. So I think another place we want to look is say, well, if we're going to regulate large tanks and fuel tanks, why not smaller tanks? Why not tanks that hold things that are equally as dangerous as diesel fuel, or perhaps much more so, right? Like, what about chlorine? What about ammonia? What about agricultural chemicals that are all over the state? So I think that's another step that will be important for the CEI Hub as well as for other places. And then most of all, the thing that I want, that I hope we'll also get to talk about just for a minute is a vision that's better than like not a vision for a future that we actually want, right? Because it's so hard when you think about everything that can go wrong everywhere. That's part of my job, right? And especially along the Willamette in the CEI Hub, all the spills and fires that are possible there, and we don't want that to happen. But also, like, oil is ending. Like, it's going slower than we'd like, right? But there won't be unleaded gas-powered cars being manufactured decades from now. Right, that's going to be over, and the demand for gasoline is going to go down. Had a very interesting conversation with DQ. What happens when only poor people have gas-powered cars? Because wealthy people all bought their Teslas, last year, right? And what about when only rural people have gas-powered cars? And now there's a limited demand for gas, and people who want gas don't have that much money. Then what will happen? My fear is that we will see the CEI Hub be abandoned, right? That it's just going to become a giant ghost town that's a brownfield that will never be recovered to the river. I desperately don't want that to happen, and also that would be terrible for the environment. And would just be such a failure. So I feel like we need a vision for the future of the CEI Hub that's better than like not the worst thing, but that's really a vision that we want and can work for. And I don't have that vision myself. I think it needs to be a collective vision. But I would be so delighted to work towards and advocate for that communal vision for the future of the CEI Hub that's what we actually want. So that's what I've been thinking about, and I'll close it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonna. And now we've got Nick Caleb from Breach Collective.
Are you my slide captain? Okay, give me that. No. Hi everyone, Nick Caleb, climate energy attorney at Breach Collective. I have slides. I hope you can read them. So I, have the privilege of going last. Sorry, I'm talking over your shoulder here, Bob. Would it be better if I stood on this side? Is that okay? Or, let's try this. Is this okay? Okay. So I have the privilege of going after 3 really strong speakers, and I'm a little bit fired up, honestly, after listening. I'm in the let's do some stuff mode, and there's stuff to do, as you heard. I want to tell a brief anecdote just to put myself into a headspace for tonight. So the last time that I was in Taborspace was actually quite a long time ago. It was 2017, and it was a time when it looked like we were about to turn a corner on climate action in Portland. If you all remember, the kind of national politics were a bit scary at that point. There'd been a big election, but locally, people were getting really entrenched and saying, okay, if the national movement is going to be toward the right and toward fossil fuels, then locally we are really going to dig in and get off of fossil fuels. And so we were upstairs in the main building here, and Ted Wheeler was in rare form that night, I remember. He was allegedly inebriated, if you believe some of his former campaign people, but he was fired up about renewable energy, right? He was talking about how we were going to 100% renewable energy. Chloe Udaly was there talking about the same thing. I started working for Udaly right around that same time, and we were serious. We went into meetings with lobbyists from PacifiCorp and PG and Northwest Natural, and they were very unhappy about plans for 100% renewable energy. We basically told them, too bad, this is happening, it's time, we're going. And they couldn't do anything about it, right? The power was there was people power, and there were elected officials who were ready to do something. And it had an effect. The city was able to do things even outside of its immediate jurisdiction. So when we were doing our quote-unquote non-binding rules for 100% renewable energy, PGE was trying to replace an old coal-fired power plant with gas-fired power plants, right? The Cardi facilities. People power combined with the city involving itself in state-level politics killed both of those gas projects and made PGE go out and acquire renewable energy. So immediately, just that sort of approach that the city had combined with people power made a real tangible impact. So that was 6 years ago, roughly now, and things could not be different, more different at the city, unfortunately. Can you skip forward, please? One more. So I only have a little bit of time, and I can't tell the full story, which would be about an hour of Zenith, just to get started. But the piece of the Zenith story that I'm going to talk about is basically what happened in 2022. So in fall of 2021, the city made this really courageous decision pushed by the community and legislators and Multnomah County commissioners, and they refused to grant Zenith Energy what's called a land use compatibility statement, a permission that Zenith needed in order to get a new air permit. And they said, we're not going to give you this because your fossil fuel activities are inconsistent with our comprehensive plan. Zenith sued them, and the city won a couple court challenges that retained that power for them. So things were looking pretty good. And then in 2022, right around in October of 2022, I guess September is when we first heard, while advocates were expecting the city to keep prevailing in court and get ready to say no to Zenith the second time, now with court decisions behind them, we get to October, and suddenly the city says, we're granting Zenith a new land use compatibility statement. We've entered into a deal with Zenith, and they promised they're going to do all this stuff, and it is what it is. Advocates were pretty shocked at the point. Nobody had been told in the advocacy community up to that point. We heard it first from Zenith's press announcement, I think on like September 15th or something like that. And people, no time to do much with 15 days or whatever until it was granted to scrutinize any of the proposals or anything like that. So by the time anybody got their feet under them, everything was signed and dotted, and we were sending that land use compatibility statement to the Department of Environmental Quality, and it was basically over. So people started thinking about this, looking into the deal, and we're saying, okay, let's take this at the best case scenario with what this deal that was struck between Zenith and the city. Zenith says they're going to move off of fossil fuels in 5 years. So they're going to remove tanks they're not using. They said they're going to reduce air pollution down from the previous year's level. We took all of those one by one. Everything but the fossil fuel claims were pretty easy to refute. They weren't that strong at all. Great, you're getting rid of tanks you're not using. Cool, that doesn't change anything. Thank you for not putting anything new in them, but that doesn't change anything. You're reducing your VOCs down 80% this year. Amazing. Well, you raised them 80% the year prior, so you're only bringing them down to what they were at before, right? So most of the offerings that Zenith were making were pretty illusory. But the big one is they're going to get off of fossil fuels in 5 years and be on so-called renewable fuels. So the best case scenario, everything goes ahead of plan. There's enough supply of renewable fuels and all the rest. The best case scenario for Portland is that our carbon footprint is slightly reduced or remains the same or is slightly increased from those fuels, because they do have an energy footprint to create, and it depends on the source of where they come from. Some of Zenith's plans talk about bringing in fuel from Singapore all the way into Portland before it's moved elsewhere. Think about the carbon footprint of that. And what absolutely will not change is that the fuel coming in on trains is going to be as dangerous to Portlanders as the oil currently is. Those trains can spill, they can tip over, they can explode. There are air emissions that come from it and all the rest. So, we started looking into it. It didn't seem that good, but what are you supposed to do, right? The process already happened. Next slide, please. So as I talk about this, I'd like to encourage you to read 2 pieces of excellent journalism that just came out yesterday about what I'm about to talk about. One is by a journalist named Nick Cunningham, who's here tonight, so you can bother him. He's in the back there somewhere, right there. He wrote an article for a DSmog blog about what I'm about to talk about. And then Jeremiah Hayden, who works at Street Roots, also put one in. So there are physical copies available. You can grab them. Next slide, please. So what happened? How did we get from, the city drawing a line in the sand saying, we're going to say no to new fossil fuel infrastructure? Because the answer to one of Jonna's questions, that for me at least, is learn how to say no. That's how you start to make change in the world, is to be able to say no to things when they're bad and not to twiddle your thumbs and come up with every excuse in the world to continue something that's polluting and bad. So the city had an opportunity to say no cleanly. It doesn't happen that often with a polluter where you get to say you're not allowed to operate here anymore. The city had the opportunity, they passed on it. So why did that happen? We started requesting records at the beginning of January at Breach Collective, and some journalists were doing it simultaneously. We learned that right about the time that the Land Use Board of Appeals issued a decision supportive of the City of Portland's ability to deny Zenith's land use compatibility statement, Zenith hired PacWest Communications as lobbyists, and those lobbyists started working inside of the city. So their first communications were in February. Next day, we get this great case. Things are looking great for the city. So there's communications happening. Then on April 26th, we think Mayor Wheeler visited Zenith, but it's not clear. There's some references to it in emails, but it's not clear if that happened. Sometime before May 2nd, Carmen Rubio appears to have met with Zenith. Again, there's suggestions, but no sort of confirmation. And then we start getting into okay, we know what happened records. So on July 12th, Jillian Shuna, who's the chief of staff for Carmen Rubio, has a phone call with Zenith in anticipation of a July 29th meeting at Zenith's oil terminal. So they're doing some planning and preparation. There was an agenda for that. And then on July 29th, Commissioner Dan Ryan, Carmen Rubio, a bunch of staff, Bureau of Planning, Sustainability, and Bureau of Development Services folks go to Zenith's physical oil terminal site and meet with Zenith's lobbyists and representatives. So keep in mind, we're all in litigation still when this is taking place. Zenith is suing the city, and city officials are being beckoned to the oil terminal site for closed door meetings. That on its own is pretty bad. Like, regardless of what happened at that point, that would be a bad situation, in my opinion, as far as trust in public governance. So what did happen? Well, once we got that far, we said, what happened at the meeting? What'd you talk about? First thing that we heard back is, there are no notes from this meeting. Sorry, right? We're just gonna visit a polluter that's suing us while litigation's happening, no notes, right? That's kind of weird. But it turns out that a planner actually did take written notes, and we were able to find those by digging a whole bunch. So I got electronic copies of a notebook with really bad cursive that it took me like a whole day to transcribe, but I finally figured it out with the help of my partner who can read better than me. And we figured out what was going on. And then there was this blacked out name and in the notebook, no explanation from the city about why it was blacked out or whatever. And so I asked to inspect it physically, and when I went in to physically inspect the notebook, see if I could like look under the marker that had blacked out, they had like written the name Jillian back under it. So somebody didn't want us to know that Jillian was asking questions that we were there. So that happens. A couple days later, the city has a meeting to do their sort of download about what happened at Zenith. We've asked for notes on that. Nobody has given us notes yet. They say those are attorney-client privilege. We can't give you those. I imagine something was discussed that's important in that meeting. I think, based on the evidence that I have, that either at the physical site or a few days after when they had this meeting, that the city gave the assent, they gave the go-ahead for Zenith for a new proposal. I think that's when it happened, right there. And maybe we'll get a document that says exactly that here in the near future. So on August 4th, incredibly, on their own volition, without any encouragement, according to the official story, while in litigation, they submit a second application that contains much of the same subject matter of the one that got denied the first time. Okay, yeah, that's plausible. And what's even more, amazing is that the city is thrilled about this. The city changes from a regulator that's skeptical about the oil industry to a facilitator of this plan. Everything has changed, and suddenly you see Rubio's office, Ryan's office, and all the bureau staff basically lining up to figure out how they can help Zenith get their proposal passed. You've got, on August 23rd, Zenith sends a rough draft of its plan to the city and basically gets edits and suggestions from the city, right? They're given like teachers doing homework or something, like this is how you gotta do it exactly to get it passed by us, right? They're having these back and forth that whole time. 2 weeks later, Zenith submits their formal Lux, right? So all of that up until that point, from July 29th to September 6th, this was like informal discussion outside of the formal process happening. So the formal process starts on September 6th, and then you've got a bunch of back and forth from city officials basically trying to help them get it over the line. September 29th, there are these great emails where the city and Zenith are like coordinating their messaging and how are we going to talk about this being a great renewable energy solution for Portland. Zenith's put out a bunch of marketing materials about how they're a renewable energy company by that point. So the full press is on for marketing, and the city's figuring out how they can help them do it. And then October 3rd, the city grants Zenith's Lux. So can you go forward, please? So I have 6 takeaways from this for me, and potentially others. I've made these records available, and so you can look at them yourself and see if you agree or if you see different things. But for me, takeaway number 1 is when the city told us as advocates in October that there's nothing to be upset about because the city reviews these Lux processes in the same manner every single time, and what are we supposed to do? We call balls and strikes, we take them like we see them. That was false. They misled the media and they misled advocates. This was a completely unprecedented process. If the city wants us to believe that while they're in litigation, they're doing site visits to people's terminals and negotiating behind closed doors constantly, I hope that's not true, because we've got a bigger problem than Zenith that's going on. So if that's the argument that they're making, I hope that that's just not true. Next, please. Second, this all changed when Zenith hired lobbyists and they went into the city and started lobbying, right? The presence of lobbyists in the city was transformative. And the personalities that made those choices, I think we should continue to scrutinize and find out what those relationships were, because it's right away, you just see a sea change in attitudes towards Zenith as soon as lobbyists are in there. Next, please. 3, the city was pushing back on us trying to get access to this the whole time. So, like I said before, Rubio's chief of staff telling us that no notes exist from these meetings. If this person hadn't taken a written notebook and they finally had it handed over to us, we'd have no record of this meeting whatsoever. And the city would be able to continue its farce that they had sort of addressed this in the normal fashion. Next, please.
How did you get them to hand it over to you?
I was dogged. I was persuasive, and we appealed a lot, and yeah. So that's what it looks like. You can see Jillian written in. Yeah, it just turns out if you ask to see something in person, then magically names appear without, it's like invisible ink, but backwards. Go for it, please. So another piece of this that as a lawyer, I think is really problematic is that there were two public interest organizations that were involved in litigation protecting the city in their first denial while this was going on, Columbia Riverkeeper and Willamette Riverkeeper. And so the city was having, in legal speak, they were having ex parte communications with a party to litigation and not even informing the other parties what was going on at that time. I wasn't a party to litigation, so I can't, do anything about that. But if I were, I would be pretty upset about that happening. Also, according to Oregon land use law, when you have ex parte communications, you're supposed to put that stuff in the public record, and that didn't happen here as well. We learned about all this from public records requests later. And then takeaway number 5, after the site visit, and sort of everything changed, Zenith got the red carpet rolled out for them. They got special treatment, they got access to lawyers and staffers, and pretty much whatever they needed to get across the finish line, they got from the city. In talking with some journalists in these articles that were written, they were saying, is this normal? Do city officials just they're talking about getting drinks together and after work and all this kind of stuff, and is this normal behavior? And I was just like, oh, not to me. I hope not. I hope this is not normal behavior. Next, please. And then sort of coming up to present day, we did find that the story doesn't end with the grant of that Lux. First of all, Zenith still has to get an air permit, right? That hasn't been granted yet. So there is an opportunity for the public and others to intervene. But Zenith is trying to get new pipes built under Front Avenue. In 2019, the city said no to Zenith's application for pipes under Front Avenue. But there was a bunch of records that I got from the city that showed that the Bureau's Planning Sustainability Director, Oliveira, just approved Zenith's initial request for permission for those pipes. And I think they might have to get some permission from the Portland Bureau of Transportation and the Bureau of Development Services before they can go forward. But it looks like they've taken a big first step toward being able to get that authorization. So again, none of this had any public involvement. One thing that I didn't mention is that Zenith has big plans beyond just kind of replacing their existing fossil fuel transport. They said they want to turn Portland into a major West Coast biofuels hub, right? And so the city is entering into negotiations essentially around a big giant development project for that area that we're all talking about getting fuels out of. The public wasn't asked if we wanted to do that. We didn't say we want to add more infrastructure for liquid fuels or move more through, right? Nobody had a say on that. So we're kind of in the same place that we were before, where the city is acting in this really helpful way for Zenith's plans, but the public is not getting any access or any ability to weigh in on that. So, to wrap this up, we said, give us a public hearing. Come on, reverse the decision. Give us a public hearing. Let us weigh in. Let us at least give you the counter argument to what Zenith is telling you, because y'all seem to be really just buying that at face value. We'd love to give you some counter arguments for you to consider. No, we can't change the process. It got to be the same for everybody. No new processes. That would be totally unfounded. We've never done anything like that before. But as we've seen, the city had a very unique, unprecedented process with Zenith. It's something that, again, in the best case scenario, doesn't leave us any better off as a city. Is there any more? Great. The most important part. What do you do about this? Can you go back one, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. So a few days ago, Breach and Columbia Riverkeeper, Willamette Riverkeeper, Portland Harbor Community Coalition, and Portland Audubon sent a letter to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's director, Leah Felden, and we made 2 asks of them. We said, look, you under your current legal authority have the ability to reject the application that Zenith has brought to you. And there are 2 grounds for doing so. One, the city's Lux process was legally insufficient, right? It breaks land use law, it flouts its own law, it misleads the public, it was hostile to transparency and all the rest. There's adequate legal authority under the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to say no on that basis alone to Zenith's air permit. So we asked that. And the second, Zenith's operations pose a serious danger for the same reason that the city denied Zenith's application in the first place. These oil trains are dangerous. We see them going to the community. We see news all over the country about what happens when an oil train or a chemical train derailment happens. It's catastrophic. We don't want that to happen in Portland, and we don't have to accept it. We don't have to accept that risk. We can say no. We could have said no as a city. We didn't. Now we can say no as a state. So we're asking our regulators to do that. So one thing you can do is team up with us and make the same ask of our regulators. And we'll be circulating another sign-on letter here soon. So if you represent an organization or a neighborhood coalition or any other kind of institution that might want to talk about that, feel free to contact me about that. Next, now that there's more information around the city's backroom deal, I don't think we should accept their sorry, we do them all the same, there's nothing you can do about it. I think that we should continue to put pressure on them to rescind their land use compatibility statement, hold a proper public process with community engagement, and allow us to actually weigh in on this. They bullied advocates when we asked for that before, and there are people in the room that can attest to, city staffers saying, we're not going to talk about that. We'll have a meeting with you, but we refuse to talk about Zenith and stuff like that. And it's like, you have to talk about Zenith. Sorry. Your fingerprints on the cookie jar. Okay. And then still a lot of people, maybe even people here, this is your first time, and sorry I'm running through this so quickly, but maybe this is your first time hearing about a lot of this stuff. A lot of people don't know, but there are now like decades of accumulated knowledge in the local climate and safety movement, and we can teach each other more about this. The more that people in our communities know both about sort of like where these trains are going, what the risks are, and then land use laws and how we can stop them and who to turn to for help and so on and so forth, the better chance we have collectively of being able to intervene in these processes and actually protect human health, safety, and the environment. So I'll leave it there. Read the articles, they're very, very good. There might be more information coming out of the city that will fill in some of the gaps of what we don't currently know, but I feel very confident looking at the information that's there and saying that this was something that happened behind closed doors, a decision that we weren't involved with, and that the city's official story just does not add up. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Everybody take a collective sigh or scream, your choice. So it's really, really clear that it's going to take, as Ted Wheeler once said about renewable energy, he once said it's going to take deliberate action to get there. We need to take deliberate collective action to hold our city and state accountable. So let's look at some ways we can take action. Please make sure to sign in tonight to stay in the loop, and the sign-in's right over there. Bonnie, wave your hand if you haven't signed in, please do so. We have these great comment cards. Please fill them out. And there's some lines you'll see on them. That's just for you to put some personal, it could just be a few words. It doesn't have to be a lot, but even just, take leadership. Do what's right, whatever you want to write on those lines. And leave those with us tonight, and we will be collecting those and turning those in for you. Remember that on the back of your program are all of the all your elected officials. There's all the contacts for them. It's really important to, like Nick said, like everyone has said again and again, to contact your elected officials and let them know what you want, what you're thinking. Make sure to show up in mass to support strong floodplain plan. Sign up tomorrow. I think tomorrow is the day, right, that we can sign up to testify in person or via Zoom. You can also send in comments too, and just go to the Willamette Riverkeeper website, and there's a It says advocacy alert, press on that and you'll have all the information you need with all the talking points. On September 6th, we're going to be putting the city on blast about this backroom deal that Nick has been talking about. We'd like to fill up the city hall with folks in general, but especially if you live in the blast zone, and you can hold up a sign with that. And yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. You'll see these signs being held up right now. On September 15th is the climate strike. And Lynn, somewhere, where are you? In the back there, waving her hand. If you want to know more about getting involved with the climate strike, that's going to be happening, and she can direct you in the right direction. And then interactive map to see if you are in the blast zone. So when you go to City Hall and you can hold up a sign. Liz and Casey are holding these up right now. You can see them. To get a yard sign. If you live in the blast zone, they have 100 to give away tonight. And I think Casey or Liz, did you want to say a couple words? Okay, so if you're interested in hosting a neighborhood gathering, having conversations with your community, that's how you build resilience, right? Yes. And so please, grab a sign and talk to them about how to do that. And once again, show up at City Hall on September 6th, and next week. And then watch out for our October Rumble that's going to be coming up. We're not going to have a Rumble in September because of all these other things that are happening. So that's kind of where we are as far as actions. I'm sure there's probably more and that folks are working on. We do have a little bit of time for question and answers, but we're going to need to end promptly at 8:30. So we'll need your help kind of putting this room back together. It's clear that our city is not doing the job we need him to do. We've heard too many times, our hands are tied, it's not my jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. So before I okay, folks, questions of each other? Anyone?
If I can just add one thing to Nick's talk, and thanks, Nick, for all your work on that. There is a link between what Nick talked about, what I talked about, and unfortunately it's Commissioner Carmen Rubio. And the floodplain plan was on track a year ago. It was going to be phased, it was going to be slow, but it was on track. Commissioner Rubio took over Bureau of Planning, Bureau of Development, and they were lobbied hard by some of the basic interests along the river, and we saw that plan just start to erode, and erode, and erode, and erode, and erode. So I really would encourage people to come on August 30th. You can testify virtually or in person. And the Riverkeeper website will give you information about, the technicalities. But we've been told, we need a strong turnout to start to get a message across to council. And I think a basic message that pulls all of this together is we are tired of seeing this council cave to powerful, well-connected, wealthy development interests at the expense of our community. Right. And it's an opportunity to send a bigger message than just the floodplains. I mean, definitely mention floodplains. But, we want a strong floodplain plan. We want you to reverse the Zenith decision. We want you to have a strong environmental agenda. And what's going on here is absolutely unacceptable. And so the 30th is a great opportunity. Send a letter, testify, but we need to gang up on every single one of these hearings now and demand change. So I guess my question would be for Jana, which is, I think you're a great asset for the governor, but how much conversation is going on between the resilience folks, the environmental advisor, and the housing people to make sure that we have an integrated, holistic, equitable, healthy, safe strategy for dealing with housing, as opposed to what we seem to be getting, which is basically caving to big developers at the expense of those things without any necessarily positive benefit for housing. That's the amazing thing, is they're not actually securing benefits for housing by doing that.
Well, obviously not enough so far. But I guess what I would say is the governor ran on an agenda that was she was straightforward about her priorities, to be fair, right? She said, I care about housing and homelessness. I care about mental health and substance abuse. Those were, and she feels very determined to, I think, keep her promises and do what she said. Which we can agree with, like politicians that tell you what they care about and then work on that. And I think she also, but the reason I was interested in working to her, although she didn't say I want to build environmental resilience, which is kind of my career, is that I felt centered in her agenda was a commitment that government ought to look after the well-being of people, that we couldn't have easy answers, that we needed to invest for people to have a good life for the long term. And I think she hasn't fully developed her agenda around what those same values look like in the environmental sphere, what those values look like in disaster resilience. But I definitely feel that the core values that underlie those considerations are also exactly what led me to do the work that I do and that lead you to do the work that you do, right? Is that we have to care about the future. We have to be good ancestors. We have to care about the well-being of people. We have to care most about the well-being of people that are currently the least well-served and that are ones who are living outside in a heat wave, right? Or the ones that we see in shelters. That are getting flooded all the time. And so I feel like the values are there and that I want to support, and we'll talk more about, to find how we can draw out those values in other ways. Because I think that they're there, and I think we just need to keep talking about it. That's my best answer. I don't know.
Anybody else have a thought?
Please no, I feel the need to repeat. I'm not our official spokesperson. Why did I take this job? because and whatever. And we said this a million times. Reasonable people can disagree, but I want someone that has integrity and that the values are there that I trust, right? Because we can disagree about some things and work together on other things, but you can't work with people you don't trust, and you don't work with people that don't care about people. Because.
John, do you feel like you have any access to the governor to maybe get her to see a little bit about what...
She packs her own lunch, which I respect, so do I. So I do see her most days when I'm in the office, in the lunchroom. That sounds funny. No, I do, and that's something I appreciate. She's very open to influence by her staff, I would say, and she's a giant reader. She takes home hundreds of pages of stuff to read every weekend. And I know people put in, like, you should read this report about climate change, or you should read this report about issues. So she really wants to be informed about things and be centered in information. I also say I have a great ally in our office in Karin Powers, you might know, who's her climate change advisor, and also my neighbor in Selwood. And so we have also been talking about the same thing, about how do we lift up those values in the environmental agenda.
Okay, so I think we can open up to questions. Just make sure that you're not talking a lot with your question, and it's really a question. Thank you.
And be loud!
Yeah, right here.
What?
Nick, so does Zenith have a history of being honest after a negotiation?
Is that a plant?
Is there any kind of loophole that the city seemed aware about in this approving this latest law?
Softballs, yeah. Zenith has a record of being fined by the Department of Environmental Quality for various environmental infractions. They got sued by the Riverkeepers, had to pay out a pretty significant penalty for water quality violations, if I remember correctly. And they also told both DEQ and the city of Portland in 2019 that they wouldn't expand throughput, which means they wouldn't move more volume of oil through the community. And for the past 4 years have continued to rack that up. So when I see something like that, I don't think it's particularly honest. If somebody who lied to me 4 times before made promises, I would be skeptical. But I think the city presently sees things different than I do. And then, yeah, a lot of people, the sort of loophole aspects, there's some really interesting communications between Zenith and the city that I didn't get to talk much about tonight, about like the city has this renewable fuels standard policy that it passed recently that I think mirrors some of the state policy around it. And Zenith was worried about it, probably because they know that the fuels that they're going to bring and transport through Portland won't meet the standards of what the Portland's renewable fuel standard is. And basically, Jillian Shuna at Rubio's office said, oh, don't worry about that. You've got a loophole. You can basically keep moving fossil fuels anyway. And even if it did apply to them, which I don't think the renewable fuel standard will, even if it did apply, that rule is written in a way where if there's not enough supply of renewable fuels, then basically the rule goes away and you can go back to doing fossil fuel stuff. So it's a very paper-thin rule in a lot of ways. Like, if the best case scenario from the, like, I guess, renewable fuels industry market perspective, then we'll have renewable fuels replacing fossil fuels and all the same hazards. But yeah, it's a debacle.
Okay, how about right here?
Yeah, Nick, aside from the alcoholic drinks that the commissioner shared with the Zenith people, what appears to be the quid pro quo? What did the rulers get out of this?
So I don't know if I don't know if the city was drinking with Zenith. I think my reference to alcoholism was, I think Ted Wheeler was intoxicated at Taborspace. I have it on good authority. But you know, it remains to be seen. I think it's kind of a boring answer that this council just wants to play ball with industry, and they think that's the way forward for electability in the future. Like, I think they watched people like Joanna Hardesty and Udaley in office get bounced out for taking more strident positions, and I think they were like, oh, you can't actually be strong on anything, or people will rebel against you and kick you out. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily what happened in those elections, but I think that's the sort of like boring answer, is that they're just like, these people have power, money, and influence in industry, and we want to make them happy. It's like, you know, in academic speak, it's neoliberalism. It's instead of regulating people, we do public-private partnerships, and we try to nudge, we never regulate, right? So it's ideological in a lot of ways. I also think that Dan Ryan never cared about this issue, that he was forced into making a courageous decision in the first place. So when presented with a way out to his mind that saw this as a reasonable deal, which according to people who met with him a couple nights ago at a public forum, he didn't really seem to understand it that well. But in his mind, this was like, it goes away. These people are not going to bother me about Zenith anymore. So unfortunately, I don't have any evidence of like bags of cash or anything like that, the like Chicago style corruption. I think it's actually like kind of more boring than that, and almost sad, because, and so, yeah, I mean, maybe it's there, I just don't, you know, those records don't come to me. But so it's more like we should be, I measure it against what we should be as a community and the promises that we made in the past about how we were going to do environmental regulation. And that could not be further away from where we are standing right now. And Bob, I think, is a great resource at telling this history really well. He's been influential on me. But, I mean, as somebody who watched us stand up to the fossil fuel industry repeatedly through the aughts, like, it doesn't have to be that way. There's no, like, we aren't forced to bend to the wills of industry or anything like that. We've beaten companies before, and we can do it again. Like, this is a strong community. So I wish that our city would trust in us. What's your opinion about Carmen Rubio?
So, my question is kind of general, maybe for all of you up on the panel. I keep hearing about resilience, and that's really important. I'd also like to hear more about prevention. Like, we can cut down a lot of trees to supposedly build housing for the houseless, but it's also going to be for McMansions, which will cause more of a problem. And that will just cause more floods, more heat domes by taking down these trees. So we'll have to be resilient because we haven't prevented. Now, Dr. Shandas, I know that you've been involved in some fairly simple prevention, like painting tarmac blacktop white. So I'd like to know if our governor, our city, are thinking about some of those preventive things. As we think about resilience, we might not need as much resilience if we think about more prevention.
So, what you're calling prevention, probably in my line of work, we would call natural hazard mitigation, right? So that's recognizing that we live in a dynamic nature that's powerful, and that we, with or without climate change, like we can't control it, but we need to design our infrastructure in our communities in ways that can accommodate that. And so actually a lot of the work with the agency, the state agency I work with most, the Department of Emergency Management, is around hazard mitigation. And it's implementing projects like tree planting, white pavement, strengthening rural water systems, tsunami evacuation planning, like all the kinds of like bread and butter work of emergency management is exactly around that. It's around the hazard mitigation, and that's like where the bulk of the dollars for this work go to. It's not the policy stuff, but it's just like kind of doing the basic work. So yeah, that's a totally an important part of it, and one we're there's a lot of federal funding for in the last couple of years. Have been working hard to like bring those dollars in to do the projects.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. I think of resilience and prevention as kind of the same thing when it comes to the natural environment. How do we create functioning natural systems that better allow us to prevent the impacts of climate change and be adaptive to them when they do occur. And I'd like to just answer John's question for one second too that you've posed to me. How do we balance housing and these natural resources? I think that's the wrong question. Environmental regulations did not cause the housing crisis, and wiping out our environmental protections will not solve the housing crisis. That is a false narrative. I think what caused the housing crisis? I'm not a housing expert, but I think it has been on some of the things I think we should be thinking about in the city of Portland. We continually upzone land from natural areas to industrial to commercial to housing. Huge windfalls for the people that own those lands, huge windfalls for developers, and we have done an abysmal job of saying, if we're going to upzone your land and you're going to make a small fortune, here's what you have to do with it. We're not going to just open it up for you. Think about places like South Waterfront. Think about the industrial areas that covered inner northwest. Think about the conversions that are going on the inner east side. All of those things that people made a fortune. Think about the post office district. And we have simply not been willing to stand up to powerful development interests and say, you're going to get upzoned and you're still going to make a small fortune, but it's going to be a smaller fortune than you thought you were going to make because you're going to build affordable housing. We're going to put restrictions on this. We should be thinking about ADUs and standing up on those issues. We're allowing lots of people to create more density. That's not converting to housing. That's converting to profit for those property owners. We need to think about infrastructure and whether we have the infrastructure in place to build the housing that we need. It's not by blowing out the urban growth boundary. We actually have plenty of land inside the urban growth boundary for housing. We don't have the infrastructure for it, and expanding the urban growth boundary will make that problem even worse. And if we are going to waive any environmental regulations or suspend them, then we damn well better get something back. And it was appalling that the governor was willing to do that and ask developers nothing in return. There was nothing built into the original request, the original legislation that said developers had to demonstrate they were going to build less expensive housing or more housing. It was simply a windfall for them at our expense. And so there are a lot of things we can do, but making our landscape less resilient, and we know that has the biggest impacts on the people who are most vulnerable, as has already been discussed many times, simply doesn't solve the problem we're trying to solve. And by the way, our planners will tell you that too. They'll tell you that the data simply does not support this strategy at all.
Do I get to respond to that? I don't want to take up all the time if there's more questions. I appreciate what you've said, Bob, and I would agree that I don't think that the housing crisis is caused by environmentalists. But I think, and I'll just say this as a recovering environmentalist myself, I worked for the Sierra Club for 5 years, right, out of school. You went to Audubon, I went to Sierra Club, right? And I was a privilege to work there, and I got to do some awesome work on environmental justice in the East Bay. And I also worked with a lot of middle-class white folks in Oakland who were concerned that housing in their neighborhood was too tall, that it was casting a shadow on their park that was unacceptable, that it was unaesthetic. And I became very uncomfortable in my role at the Sierra Club because I did see that part of the work we were doing was empowering people who had wealth and privilege and own property to keep their neighborhoods the way they wanted and keep those people out. And I think we have to own that the history of the environmental movement is super white. It reflects a lot of privilege, and in parts it has contributed to it has contributed to this dynamic where it's seen as a conflict between the environment and housing. And I also think it's totally true that if we look at the history of Oregon, we have to own that all those land claims, all those property, right, that was stolen from people of color and given to white people who cut down trees and developed it and became wealthy and became homeowners. And now if we think about the justice that we owe to history, yes, we owe justice to the environment and to folks that were here before, but we also have to think about folks who are disenfranchised and are houseless. And I feel very uncomfortable to say that there's not an element of justice, as we do have to find housing for people that are living outside and that are also living in our urban natural areas and whatever. We've been to Oaks Bottom together. You've seen that there's people that are there right now, right, that are camping. It's a toilet because they don't have a place to use the bathroom. There's trash. Like, there are also harms to the environment that occur from people camping in an unorganized way. So that's not just, so I feel like, well, I think you're telling a true story, but it's not the whole story, right? Because the other part is, but we do have to figure out a way to get people housed. And so it's not saying, okay, don't take away the environment, but what's the strategy? Like, you got to partner yourself with somebody that's got a strategy on the housing side, right? Because it's just like, oh, I'm going to hit you with John Muir now. I saved this one. Because when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find a hitch to everything else in the universe, right? So if you're gonna save the environment, you got to, oh my gosh, I'm not giving you the mic. I'm going to give you the mic. Right? So we can be partners in this, right? We got to find housing. We got to not cut down all the trees to do it.
Anytime the governor wants to call me, I'm available to be. But what I would be the last person to deny that the environmental movement has challenges with equity and racial justice. I will say that the very first thing I ever testified on behalf of for Portland Audubon in 1993 was affordable housing. And my testimony on behalf, and this is Mike Haug, by the way, sent me out to testify that we have an affordable housing crisis coming, 1993. Yep. And we're standing here with our housing partners to tell City Council that you should prioritize housing, even if that means diminishing the environmental investments you make in this budget, 1993. So we also have a history of partnering well, and I appreciate the fact that a lot of the housing advocates recognize that this isn't an either or, it's a both and. But I think, honestly, John, I think you're turning the environmental justice arguments on their head. The fact that the environmental movement has environmental justice problems does not mean that we should start cutting down trees, filling wetlands, reducing eco-risks. No, I know.
I think you only have half the solution, right?
Well, no, I'm saying that we have to address those things, and we need to find solutions, and we need to have a climate change strategy and a housing strategy. Yes. But what we're hearing from the governor's office is that environmental regulations are the problem, and in the name of housing, we're going to attack these regulations. And that is turning environmental justice inside out, upside down, and backwards. We need to work together to find solutions that achieve the both and. Yes. And the environmental community is ready to do that. The question is whether the governor's office is ready to do that and whether city council is ready to do that.
Time to put in oil tanks. A black community where Zenith is now, who will ever recognize that they kicked people out to put in the CEI Hub? It was not a black place. I was just at Lloyd Center at a county health board meeting. And you know what? I said, what is the state plan for fentanyl, a county health plan? into drug use. There are empty apartments all over North Portland. Drive up Interstate, drive down Lombard, anybody who lives there, for lease, for rent. And then on top of that, the developers are coming in, knocking down affordable houses, knocking down the trees, and putting barbed wire around them. You know that, people who live near me. Empty lots. Why are they tearing down houses that hold maybe 15 people? They can put a camper, they can put a garden, they can put an elderly person or a foster child, but it is an empty lot with barbed wire. And the reason why they're doing that is because they're getting a tax break. Nobody in North Portland is trying to provide housing for low-income people. Most of it is being these big apartments. Sir, it's not impacting anybody that needs a house.
Sarah, do you have everything you're saying is right on. Do you have a question of our panel?
My question is, how did you go about letting people have tax breaks for taking down houses where people used to live and putting barbed wire in their place? And why is the no-federal policy at the same time as the housing?
I don't know if I don't know.
I mean, I'm asking the person from the state. How is it? Why is that happening? Why?
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
That's the honest answer. I don't know. We need to talk more, I think.
Drive around and look as the governor driven around.
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna stop, but it sounds like we have to show up at city council.
What color do you wear?
What color?
Here's Mike.
Okay, well, first of all, we need to show up for all of the city council meetings that we can to let the city know that we're not going to kowtow to developers, right? And to industry that they need to be leaders. They need to be bold leaders, and that we're not going to put up with it. I don't know about what color, Bob, is there a certain color clothing we're supposed to be wearing?
Let's go with blue.
Okay, so blue for Wednesday for blue, and then the following September 6th, red.
Okay.
Right? Okay. But you can wear different colors too.
Hey, I just want to give credit to Jonna because she didn't know what she was getting into tonight, and she's actually been responsible for a lot of progress in the city of Portland, and we're damn lucky to have her in the governor's office as well. So, thank you.
And also, we're just lucky that you are all colleagues of each other.
I have to give it thanks to Bob because I met him 18 years ago. I was environmental planner for the city of Lake Oswego. We're going through the great coyote wars of 2004. They wanted to trap all the coyotes out of Lake Oswego. That somehow made sense. He helped me a great deal. And then I got my first job working for an elected official because he called the mayor's office and was my personal reference. So, yeah, so I'm very grateful to you too.
So it's actually a love fest up here, and so let's thank all of our panelists for being amazing